Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. Today we're on Part 12. We're going to look at another area that Protestantism moved into in Western Europe. So the topic today is the Reformation in the Low Countries. We begin by looking at the political situation in this area. Near the mouth of the Rhine River, there was a group of territories jointly known as the 17 Provinces. This area is roughly in modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So another area that's still not been developed into countries yet. They're loosely united, but they definitely have differences as well, as we'll see. Charles V, remember he was the emperor at this time, was in possession of these territories. Since he had been born and raised in the region, he was well liked by the inhabitants. If you'll remember, Charles V was a controversial figure. As his life went on, he was liked less and less, but in this area, he was always liked, because he was a native of the area. And so that made people kind of overlook some of the problems that other people saw, and they tended to support him throughout his reign. Though Charles V encouraged unity, these areas retained many of their ancient cultural practices and forms of government. One of the things that Charles V wanted to do was to unite this area. And that was for two reasons. One, it made it easier for him to rule, but also he wanted the area to be stable, and he wanted to see unity there. And that was somewhat done, but in spite of what may have been done politically and maybe from the outside looking in, seemed to be pretty unified. There was definitely still differences and definitely still interests in the different areas that kept them from being completely unified. In 1555, Charles V placed the 17 provinces under the rule of his son Philip. In 1556, Philip received from his father the crown of Spain. Philip made it clear that his priority was Spanish rule. Charles wanted to have his son take control of this area. He definitely had a special place in his heart for it, but he couldn't just put his time into trying to get things there the way he wanted them to be. So he thought the best thing to do would be to put his son, who would one day be the emperor as well. And he did that. But about a year later, Philip got the crown of Spain, and Philip was more interested in Spain than he was this area of the 17 provinces. And that became very clear. And as a result, Philip was much less of a popular ruler than his father, Charles. The Low Countries were put at the service of Spain. This provoked the resentment of the leaders of the 17 provinces, who then opposed Philip's efforts to complete the act of unification which his father had begun. As the ruler of both areas and as the ruler that preferred Spain, the Low Countries kind of took a back seat to them. But not only that, they became kind of the area to support Spain. So Philip, he was ruling both areas. One was a priority, and one, he would just use whatever resources he could from them, just sucking the people dry in order to prop up Spain. Well, it didn't take very long for this area to figure out that was the case, and that caused a lot of resentment, and it caused people to oppose what Philip wanted to do. Even the things that maybe they didn't oppose with his father, now they are going to oppose, because it is Philip, and they don't like the way that he has set them up. Well, about this same time, Protestants began to come into the area. Even before the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation, the Low Countries had seen a strong movement of Reformation. This was the birthplace of the Brethren of the Common Life and the greatest of the humanist reformers, Erasmus of Rotterdam. You can remember we talked about Erasmus early on, and he was the guy who was part of this humanist movement, which kind of was going on at the same time as the Protestant Reformation. It actually predated the Protestant Reformation, but also overlapped it. And this was a group of people that wanted to go back to the old text. They wanted to go back to the days that would have been the early days of Christianity, not just because of Christianity, and maybe not even primarily because of it, but because they wanted the literature and the culture of those days, what had been kind of lost when Rome was taken over and fell. And then definitely during the Middle Ages, the information was retained, but there really wasn't anything done to go beyond it. It just was kept up with. So they wanted to go back to those early texts. They were very interested in reading those documents about the history of the culture, which also would have been the history of the Christian church and the documents that became the New Testament. They wanted to learn to read them in the original language in which they were written. And so they were very interested in learning Greek. And they went back and read and found that many of the practices that were going on in the Catholic Church were not really in keeping with what the early church had done. And in fact, in some ways, it was downright contradicted it. So this group was what they were very much for Reformation. They weren't, at least initially, were not for the Protestant Reformation being a offshoot or to break away from the Catholic Church. They actually wanted the church to reform, and that's what Erasmus wanted. But it still did put them in the camp of saying that, yeah, we do see the need for Reformation, and yeah, we do want to get involved in it. And as time went on, the Protestant Reformation became more stabilized, became more viewed as being legitimate. Some of this group started to come in with them. And so this area is very ripe to hear a message of reform. And so they're going to get that message. One emphasis of the Brethren of the Common Life was a need to read Scripture. Therefore, the Protestant Reformation was well received in the area. So again, as I just mentioned, this was one of the big things they wanted to do. They wanted to go back and read the Scriptures for themselves. And they definitely wanted to read them in the original language. They also wanted to have copies of the Scriptures translated in the vernacular of the different areas. They didn't want it all in Latin because not everybody knew Latin. And many people could not read it for themselves, and they just had to take the word of those who were educated and were most likely leaders in the church. And it didn't necessarily always give them the whole truth as far as what the Scripture was saying, or at least they gave an interpretation of it that was based more on their own opinion than it is on the actual text. So this dovetailed very well with the Protestant Reformation, and it was therefore well received. Soon Lutheran preachers entered the region and gained large groups of followers. The Anabaptists followed, and they made great headway as well. So again, this area was very ripe to hear this message, and it bore fruit right away. Finally, there was a great influx of Calvinist preachers from Geneva, France, and southern Germany. And so here they came. The Calvinists are now, the Reformed preachers are coming in. They're going to bring their take. So they have the Lutherans, they've got the Anabaptists, and then they've got the Reformed movement. So they've got the major branches. Of course, that doesn't include the Church of England, but that really wasn't necessarily a branch of Protestantism that was going to ever spread. So they've got everybody else in basically, and they're making headway. These Calvinist preachers would prove the most successful, and Calvinism would become the main form of Protestantism in the region. Of all the areas all the different branches that came in, Calvinists were the ones that took hold, and they were the ones who put deep roots in the area. Well, as you're probably not surprised because of the history that we've already dealt with, there was certainly going to be resistance to this Protestant reform movement coming into this area. Charles V took stern measures against the spread of Protestantism in these lands. He issued several edicts targeting Anabaptists in particular. So once again, the Anabaptists are the low man on the totem pole. And the biggest reason for that is they had the most drastic change from the Catholic Church. And one thing they did, and what their name is all about, was they changed what the practice was as far as baptism went by eliminating infant baptism. So even the Protestant movement branches that should have done away with infant baptism, they didn't necessarily do that, at least not right away. And so that made them at least a little bit more tolerable to the Catholics. But when you got the Anabaptists over here saying your baptism didn't count when you were a baby, that none of the other Protestant movement branches were saying that. And so that put them even further beyond what the Catholic Church was teaching and made them a target of everybody. So here, once again, Charles V, he looks at all these groups and he says, if I'm going to pick one to go after, it's going to be the Anabaptists. Yet these edicts, though they proceeded one after the other, did nothing to stem the tide of Protestant teaching and conversions. We've talked about this several times now, but the more that Christianity is persecuted, the more bloodshed there is, the more it costs something real, something major for you to be a Christian, the more it spreads. All of these ideas by these leaders through the years have all been wrong when it comes how to stop Christianity from being effective. If you want to figure out how to make it less effective, just look what's happening in America today. It's not that Christianity is being widespread persecuted in any kind of way that would be similar to the ways it's been persecuted through the years. Now, there's probably some bias in some places against Christianity, but it's just that nobody really cares that much about it anymore. It doesn't cost you anything to be a Christian for the most part, and there's certainly not going to be anything like this. And as a result, we're seeing less and less effectiveness by the Christian church. It's just an afterthought in a lot of ways. So these groups, these leaders, they went the exact opposite way. If they had just ignored them, they probably would not have been as effective in bringing their message out. But there's just something about when someone's willing to die, or they're willing to lay their life down in some way, they're willing to really pay a heavy cost for something, that gets people's attention. And in a lot of ways, that's very attractive. Not saying that you want to die yourself, but to be able to say, hey, there's something to this, because you don't just give your life up for no reason. There's something real about this, and that it's happened that way everywhere it's ever spread. So once again, people don't learn the lessons of history, and they make the same mistakes over and over. And so the effect of the resistance to Christianity to Protestantism is that Protestantism is going to spread. Tens of thousands died for their faith. Leaders were burned, followers were beheaded, and many Protestant women were buried alive. That is pretty horrific if you think about it. Being burned alive is horrible. Being beheaded, I mean, I don't want to sign up for it, but of these three things, I would take that one. At least it's fast. And you can sit here and say it doesn't hurt. I don't know that it doesn't, but it's not going to hurt for long. It's going to be over quickly. Being burned, that could take some time. I mean, it's not going to be instantaneous death, most likely. But boy, being buried alive, that is barbaric. It's unreal. You think about some of the things that have been done in the name of Jesus Christ through the years. It really is disturbing. And we know that this is a different time in history. That people were not the way that society has evolved to be now. Having said that, there's still there's a long way from that to you thinking it's okay to bury someone alive. That is horrific at any time, and there's no excuse for it. Even though it was a different time, even though they did handle things in a different way, that is sick. And there's some sick things that go on during these days. And, it's easy to get down on the Catholic Church for doing this stuff, but it's not going to be that many more years from now that the Protestant Church is going to turn around and end up doing the exact same stuff to people. It's kind of heartbreaking to think about it, but it definitely happened in history. In spite of all of these cruel punishments, Protestantism continued its advance, and it's not even in spite of, it's probably because of them, because of the way people treated it. It was absolutely guaranteed to succeed. It's just the way it works. You can try to explain the psychology of it. You can think about it. There are some things that make sense about it. There are other things that you think that I can't believe it works that way, but it happens everywhere. There's nowhere that I know of in history that when Christianity was heavily persecuted that it just stamped it out. The examples I know of, it just makes it thrive. And it did once again. Let's look now further into Philip's rule. And he, again, is not going to be a very popular ruler. Though his father Charles was popular in the region, Philip was not. Through a combination of folly, obstinacy, and hypocrisy, he gained even greater enmity. So he already wasn't real popular just because of the fact that he openly preferred Spain to this lower region, this low country region. If that wasn't bad enough, he also made a lot of mistakes in his rule. He did some stupid stuff. He did things that people looked at and just saw him as being arrogant or hypocritical or whatever. And you're just not going to win people over to being that way. And he was. Philip decided to return to Spain and left his half-sister, Margaret of Parma, in charge. So that's even more of a slap in the face. He wants to go to Spain. He don't want to be there. And he doesn't care any more about it than just leave his sister in charge. So Just one more strike against him. People are looking around thinking, this dude, he's not the guy for us. To strengthen her authority, Philip quartered Spanish troops in the Low Countries. These troops required the support of the resources of the land. So it gets worse. Not only does Philip leave and abandon the country that he is supposed to be ruling, not only did he then just leave his half-sister in charge, but he also, because of him not being there, makes an imposition on the people by sending Spanish troops. Again, the Spaniards are coming in to rule things, to run things. And if that wasn't bad enough, the people in the area had to be the ones to take responsibility and to use up resources to house these people, to feed them, to take care of them, that were then going to turn around and be the ones to try to tell them what to do. So just there's nothing about that scenario that's going to endear people to Philip. It's going to just make them more bitter and make them want him gone even more. Friction and clashes soon developed between the troops and the inhabitants of the area. Oh, that's to be expected. That's not a surprise. Added to this was the appointment of new bishops who were given inquisitorial power. So this is the Inquisition we've talked about that happened throughout Europe. We especially remember the Spanish one, and these people are coming from Spain. So this is not going to make people feel good. Since the inhabitants knew that the Inquisition in Spain had been used as an instrument of torture, they feared that the king intended to do the same thing in their country, and their fears were well-founded. They didn't want any part of this. Philip also used foreign advisors to implement his offensive policies and practices. So he doesn't use people that are native to the area. He doesn't ask their advice. He doesn't try to get people that know the ones he's ruling so that he can be able to connect with those of his subjects and be able to do things in a way that he can get their support. No, he goes in and brings his guys from Spain that he likes, and he gets them to give their opinions, and their opinions don't have anything to do with the area or the way things will run in a smooth way. They're going to just be based on what they want, and it's going to be interests that are outside of that area. So he gets them to come in and implement the things that the people find offensive about what he wants to do. And it makes it worse that it's not only him doing it, but there's these foreigners coming in and running this country's, the area as well. So again, just one more nail in his coffin. The leaders of the 17 provinces sent the Count of Egmont to Spain to argue their cause. He was well received by Philip, and promises were made to radically change policy in the region. So the area decides diplomacy is the best tactic first. Let's send somebody to have a talk with this guy. Let him know, hey, look, this is not working out very well. What can we do? And so this count goes in, and he's well received. He's brought right in. Philip tells, oh yes, I want to hear what you have to say. Oh, let me go ahead and change my policies. Yeah, we want to make everything great in the area. So this count, he heads on home thinking he's done pretty well. However, when the count returned and opened the sealed letter Philip had sent back with him, he was bitterly disappointed to discover the letter contradicted what the king had promised. So Philip sends this letter with him, kind of tells him, do not open till you get back home. Let me get this guy on out of here. And he gets back home, opens the letter thinking, all right, I'm about to deliver the good news. And he finds out there isn't any good news. It's none of the stuff that they talked about's in that letter. So he's looking like a fool right now. He's not happy. At the same time, Philip sent word to Margaret that the decrees of the Council of Trent against Protestantism be enacted, and that all who oppose them should be put to death. Philip wants to go after the people. There's a lot of Protestants here. The leaders and magistrates of the 17 provinces were not prepared to execute a vast number of their fellow citizens. There's going to be a lot of people. If you go into this and just let's kill anybody that's a Protestant, it's going to be a bunch. And the leaders of the areas are saying, whoa, wait a minute here. We can't do this. We're going to end up killing a vast number of our own citizens for this crazy king that doesn't even want to be here. So one more shot down for Philip. He just is not making any good decisions at all. They appealed to Margaret. One of her courtiers intervened, telling her that she ought not to heed nor fear, quote, those beggars. So he kind of throws an insult at the people, but as usually happens through time in history, those little names that people are called, they take them up. And they make the decision that you want to call me something nasty, great. I'm going to embrace that and we'll show you just what we are. And that's what happens right here, as this group became known as the Beggars. This opposition group adopted the name as a badge of honor. The leather bag of a beggar became the symbol of resistance. The symbol took root among the entire population. So all over the place in this area, these leather bags would show up on people that weren't beggars and shouldn't have been carrying around a leather bag. But people, when they saw it, they realized what it was for. It was that they were making a statement that they were part of the opposition to the government. And there's not a whole lot the government can do about that. I mean, what are you going to do? Round up everybody that's carrying a bag? They just kind of had to deal with it. The movement quickly took on religious overtones. Frequent outdoor meetings saw Protestantism and opposition to authority preached under the same protection of armed beggars. So they kind of joined forces with the group in the countries that were nationalistic and didn't want this Spanish rule. They're on the same side because they have a common enemy, so to speak. And so they got lumped together. This tended to happen in all these places. The political movements to resist would get combined with the Protestant movement that was also seen as being resisting the Catholic Church, the established order of things. And so they're lumped in together. Bands of armed iconoclasts invaded churches, overturning altars and destroying images and other symbols of the old religion. No one intervened. So these Protestant groups would go into the Catholic churches and they would rip out anything that had an image, any kind of altar to a saint, any kind of statue, those kind of things. They got rid of them. They didn't agree with having them. And it was a strike against the Catholic Church, and nobody did anything about it. They didn't stand up against these people because they weren't against them. The leadership in the area actually, they didn't plan it, but they also didn't do anything about it. And anybody that was strongly Catholic that wouldn't like it, they were too scared to go against the beggars. So everybody just pretended like, well, we don't know what happened. Finally, the Council of State appealed to William of Orange, whose advice they had frequently chided. William intervened and violence abated. So this guy, William of Orange, he was a guy that had given them advice through the years on how to do things the right way. They didn't want to listen to it. They made fun of him. They didn't listen to his advice, but now they're in a situation where they don't know what to do. And so they go to William, and he intervenes. They know that the people will listen to him. The leadership might not have, but the common people would. And they did, and he was able to get them to settle down a little bit. This was accomplished only after the Inquisition was suspended and a limited freedom of religion was allowed. So there had to be some concessions made, and one was, we're going to get rid of this Inquisition deal, and we're not going to go forward with that, and we're going to give you some limited freedom of religion. When I say limited, it was very limited. The beggars promised to refrain from action as long as the government did not seek to impose the Inquisition and other forms of repression. So they made their agreement. We'll settle down too. We're not going to keep attacking your churches. We're not going to keep doing the things we've been doing. We'll settle down. But while Philip agreed to abide by the agreements reached in the provinces, he was secretly raising an army to force his will and faith on the Low Countries. So once again, Philip, he's at a point where he's kind of made a little bit of headway. He's made up a little ground. He's dug himself a little bit out of the hole that he was in, and no sooner had he done it. In fact, while he was doing it, he was actually digging deeper, because he's telling them everything they want to hear. Oh yes, we're going to go along. We're going to have some compromises. Everything's going to be okay. And at the same time, he's getting an army together to attack. If you want to get a study, if you're in any kind of leadership role, if you want to get a study on how not to go about doing things, just study this dude, Philip, and just basically do the opposite of everything he did, and you'll be in pretty good shape. William of Orange, who knew of the king's activities, advised his friends, especially the counts of Egmont and Horn, to join in armed resistance. They refused, and William withdrew to Germany. So William was privy to this. He knew what Philip was doing. And so he goes to his friends and the nobility. He goes to the counts of Egmont and Horn and others as well. It wasn't just those two. And he tells them, guys, you better get an army together because you're going to be attacked. And they didn't believe him, or they didn't take it seriously. They thought that Philip wouldn't do that. And so they refused to join in any kind of armed resistance. And William said, you know what? You guys are going to just sit there like sitting ducks and take this. I'm getting out of here. And so he goes to Germany to get away from it. And just as William had said, the invasion was soon to come. Early in 1567, the Duke of Alba invaded the country with an army of Spanish and Italian troops. His mission was to drown all rebels and heretics in blood. Ugh, gruesome. He organized the Council of Disturbances, which was soon dubbed the Council of Blood. This court was not bound by any legal requirements, so this was a court that could do anything they wanted to do. Basically, they said what they were investigating, they didn't need to have they didn't need to have any kind of trial for. If they saw it, they would know it. If there's any kind of treason or acts against the state or whatever, heretical people running around, they would know it and they would take care of it. And so no checks on this. They're going to go through and run roughshod over the people. So once again, people, you want to get a group of people to resent you, pull some of this mess, and they did. Protestants were condemned for heresy and Catholics for sufficiently resisting heresy. Even expressing doubt as to the authority of the council was high treason. So if you're a Protestant, you were heresy. So you're gone, you're done. But if you're a Catholic and you didn't sufficiently resist the heresy, if they didn't determine that you were strongly opposed to it and to the point of trying to do something about it, then you were guilty too. So even those that were not part of the Protestant movement could be convicted by this group. So it's a bad deal for sure. Treason was also brought against anyone who had opposed the reorganization of the church or who had declared that the provinces had right and privileges that the king could not overturn. So here's where freedom of speech comes in. A lot of people misunderstand freedom of speech. Freedom of speech doesn't mean you can say anything you want to with no consequences for it. That's not what it is. Freedom of speech is something like this, where you can talk about the government and there can't be legal action taken against you. You can't be put in prison. You can't be in some way punished for that. So here you have a situation that you've got a group that just purely by saying that they disagree with the government, they're immediately going to be punished. And that kind of thing was not tolerated later on in history, and although it is in places today, but in our country, there were some laws put in place to try to avoid having that happen. And for the most part, it has, although it hadn't 100% all the time. So numerous were those put to death by the council that chroniclers of the time speak of the stench in the air and the hundreds of bodies hanging from trees along the wayside. That's pretty gross. The counts of Egmont and Horn were arrested and eventually executed. So their little faith in the king didn't work out so well for them. Since William of Orange was not available, his 15-year-old son was captured and sent to Spain. So William, he had already left. He had withdrawn, and they couldn't get him, but they said, well, we may not be able to get you, but we can get your son, and they did. And that's not going to be very popular in William's eyes. Alba seemed sure to prevail when the rebels received support from sailors who Orange had granted privateer licenses in the hopes that they would harass Alba's communication with Spain. William sees these sailors who he's thinking, all right, maybe we can use these guys to help us on the sea. And he realizes that the naval force that he's up against is not real strong. So he gets these guys. And at first, they're just a loose crew. They're more or less just pirates on the sea. But they start to organize and they become more effective. Known as the Beggars of the Sea, the small group of sailors organized, and Philip's naval forces were unable to contain them. They were able to capture the city of Brill. Their brilliant maneuvers made them a legend and inspired the resistance on land. So this group was very effective and they really did help. But unfortunately, lacking the funds to continue to support them, William of Orange was forced to disband his troops. So a lot of times in these days, the military was comprised of, it may be people from your nation who volunteered, but it was also a lot of mercenary forces. So it's people that you paid. And once the money ran out, the army ran out. And that's basically what happened here. Alba's vengeance was terrible. His armies took city after city and repeatedly broke the terms of surrender. Prisoners were killed for no reason, and several cities were torched. Women, children, and the elderly were also killed along with the rebels. Soon, Alba held all rebel strongholds. So this dude, even though there's some resistance, even though the Beggars of the Sea have helped, they're still not turning the tide. And the forces by Alba are really starting to take a toll on the people. But eventually, peace did come. The Spanish sought to disrupt the unity of the area by exploiting the religious differences between the Catholics of the southern provinces and the Protestants of the northern region. So Spain's interfering again. This weakened the Protestant cause, and its armies were repeatedly defeated. So the Protestants didn't really ever do that well militarily, but they were able to hold out. But at the Siege of Leyden, the Protestant armies won at great cost. An army sent by William of Orange was defeated by the Spanish, and 2 of his brothers were killed. William next suggested that the dikes be opened, flooding the land around Leyden. This would destroy many years of hard work and lead to the loss of a great deal of land. William's solution was, let's just flood everything. You can't really have a siege if you're underwater. So it was about the only choice they had, really. It was either that or surrender. And the people decided that they would go along with it. They continued their resistance for 4 months until the waters reached Leyden. So they held out for 4 months. The waters came, and with the waters, the beggars of the sea were able to come. So they rode in on the flood. And obviously, when you're trying to do a siege on land, you don't have a lot of naval support. So the Spanish were lacking in naval support, and they were forced to abandon the siege. And so technically it was a victory, but it was one that came at a pretty great cost. So it's hard to really get excited about it, but at least they did everything that they had to do to keep from falling, and it did cost a lot. Philip II was still not willing to give up the fight. His armies now focused on the easier targets of the southern province. In 1580, Philip II issued a bounty on the head of William of Orange. In 1583, an assassin was finally able to kill William. Well, this is King Philip, and he's just not a good ruler, and he's making everybody angry. He's not willing to give in. He's not willing to admit that he's been beaten, or at least that he's probably never going to succeed in what he wants to do. And so what he decides to do is to start targeting the southern province. Well, the southern province is the Catholic area, but he still goes after them anyway. It kind of galvanizes them with the Protestants for a little while, though that doesn't last. And then eventually Philip says, I'm tired of this William Orange. He is always bringing armies against me. He's thwarting what I want to do. So I think I'm going to just have him killed. And he did eventually do it. It took 3 years, but they were able to kill William. But that didn't end up being actually a very good thing, because William's son Maurice proved to be a better general than his father. So you got rid of one guy, but you put one in his place that's actually better than he was. And Maurice was able to lead the troops in several victorious campaigns. William's exploits as a military leader were never really great. They never really won much. At best, that was I guess you could consider a tie that cost a lot. But Maurice comes in and they start winning. Then that really changes things. Finally, in 1607, almost a decade after the death of Philip II, Spain decided their losses in the struggle were not worth the effort and signed a truce. So Spain finally just said, no moss, we're done. And they signed the truce and decided to go put their efforts elsewhere. By then, the vast majority of the population in the northern provinces were Calvinists, while the southern provinces remained Catholic. So there still was a lot of Catholic there. The northern part, it kind of just stayed what it had been. The southern part had stayed Catholic through all this, and the northern part was progressively more Protestant and particularly Calvinist through this. Eventually, the area formed 3 countries. We know these today. One was Protestant, and that's the Netherlands, and then there were 2 that remained Catholic, and that's Belgium and Luxembourg. So that's all we have time for today. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this as we look at that low country area. Next week, we're going to get into an area that you may be a little bit more familiar with, and definitely it's going to be a lot of wars and a lot of conflict, and that is the Protestant movement in France. So hope that you can come and join me then. In the meantime, God bless, and talk to you next week.